Hi, I'm Jason Duro. I'm a fantasy author, and today I want to talk about how to create a sense of consistency and continuity in your fantasy world building. When it comes to world building in fantasy or in any fiction, having a sense of continuity and consistency is really important for keeping things on track and making your world believable and keeping the reader engaged. If you have inconsistencies or breaks in continuity or things that don't feel quite right, that can just pull the reader right out of the story. So I'm going to talk about 4 big tips for keeping your worlds consistent and having continuity for keeping the readers engaged. The first one is you want to make sure that you have a consistent set of rules in your fantasy world. This is obvious when it comes to things like basic physics and making sure the world just rotates the way it should, which you could change that as long as you're consistent with it. But it also comes to making sure that your rules are consistent with magic and the way that things work with more fantastical elements in your world that you're creating yourself. For example, if you have a magic spell that a spellcaster is using, that the spell's only supposed to work when it's cast inside a certain place, and then later you have it work just as well outside. That's just a little thing that little break can make the world seem not as real. It can make the fantastical elements seem like they are just sort of slapped together and don't have a lot of thought to them, and that kind of thing can disengage the reader really quickly. So what you need to do is to put some thought at the beginning into what the rules are going to be, and you might even want to spend some time doing rule building and building out your systems, building your magic system in particular. There are a lot of techniques and tools that can help you with building out your systems and making them consistent. One that I like a lot that I've used myself is a book called The Magic System Blueprint. It's by C.R. Rowanson. It's available on Amazon, and he also has a YouTube channel and has information available out there about how he builds magic systems. But using something like that can get you on track and help you to have a guide to how to put all this stuff together. And once you have it together, once you've established your rules, you'll have your own blueprint there that you can use to follow and make sure that everything stays consistent and that you don't contradict yourself. Second, let's talk about a consistency with the lore and history in the world that you're building. History is something that is fairly immutable depending on who is writing the history. I mean, people in the future can bend the facts and can change things, but when you're world building, you want to know what really happened in the history of your world and how it affects the current day in your world. For example, if there are wars in your world's history between different factions, it's important to be consistent with what happened during those wars when you mention them in the story, and the reasons and what caused the factions to go to war with each other and the origins of the factions. If you mess up with some of those details and tell it one way in one place and a different way in another place, those little things are things that readers can pick up on that will make it seem like you didn't put a lot of effort into the world building, and it makes them not value your story as much. It makes them come out of the story feeling like they shouldn't invest if you didn't invest. There are a few different ways to make sure you stay on track with your history and your lore and your world building, and one is to go sort of what I call full Tolkien with it, to build out just volumes of lore, build out volumes of history about all the different peoples, the cultures, all of the history. You can even develop languages. You can have history going back hundreds and thousands of years back and have it all develop forward. You run the risk when you do that of getting too deep into the world building and then not actually getting around to writing the piece itself. You'll end up with volumes of information about your world's history and about its lore, and that could be really interesting, could be really useful, and it could be helpful to you. But I don't do it that way because I know myself well enough to know that if I go down that rabbit hole, I'll just keep going down that rabbit hole and I won't end up writing what I originally set out to write. I'll be too wrapped up in all this world building detail. Another way, and what I prefer, the way that I actually do it, is I will figure out what a general history of the world is and the general lore around things that set up things to the point that they are now. And as I'm writing, I will come up with the details. I'll come up with the name of a war. I'll come up with the name of a faction, the name of a country, and I will pepper that in where it needs to go in the story as I'm writing it. And I will take notes in sort of a series Bible, I call it, as I'm going along, so that I can keep track of these historical events and this lore that I've created as I'm writing. And then as I go through, I make sure I keep it consistent by referring back to that series Bible and making sure that I don't say anything that's in contradiction to what I've already established. But I only set up as much as the reader needs to see. Because the reader's not going to need to know all that deep stuff that you might create if you went the Tolkien route with it. The reader's only going to see everything that you present in the prose and the course of the story. And you don't really want to generally be doing a lot of info dumping because that messes up the speed and the pace and the momentum of the story. So you'll be giving the reader the world building through action, through dialogue, and through things like that, and just build it out as you need to give it to the reader and then keep track of it so you stay consistent. And that's a lot quicker and a lot easier than doing the deep route. Again, you can go full Tolkien with it, but I prefer to do the simpler version. And now the third thing, let's talk about continuity through geography and the landscape of your world. Fantasy readers love maps. I put maps in my books. I like seeing maps in other people's books. It's not essential to do it, but it's something that most fantasy readers that I've heard from really appreciate. So if you have the capability of creating a map, it's something to look into to include in your books. Again, you don't have to do it, but even if you don't create a map to put in your book in a publishable way, I highly recommend creating a map of your world or your city or wherever it's set when you start out, just to use as a reference for yourself. Because if you are building this world, you're building the landscape, you're putting cities down, you're putting rivers, you're putting all this stuff down, it's really, really easy to lose track of where you have placed all this stuff if you don't have a visual reference to it. And then you'll get down the road, you'll get midway through your book, and an eagle-eyed reader will realize that one of your characters has just traveled 10,000 miles on horseback in the course of 2 days. And that kind of thing is easy to fix. It's easy to keep from doing that. If you just make a map for yourself, it can just be as simple as sketching it out yourself or just drawing it on a piece of paper. It doesn't have to look great, but as you're writing, you can do like I was talking about in the previous section about the lore and the history. You can do that with the geography. As your characters come to a new city that you hadn't planned to be there before, put the city down on the map, show where it is in relation to other things you've referred to, and then write about that in the context of where it's located in the world. That will help you to know what's north of you, what's west, how far you are from this river that's to the east, how far you are from the coast. It helps keep things consistent just to have that visual reference there for you to look at. Nobody else has to see it, but having a visual map is super important, in my opinion, to keeping things consistent with your geography. And then if you're able to get an artist to do it, or if you have the skill yourself, you could convert that into a publishable map and stick it right in the front of your book, and most readers will appreciate that. And finally, the fourth thing that I want to talk about is the importance of having continuity and consistency in your characters and culture when you're doing your world building. Characters are the backbone of every story. Regardless of how great your plot is, regardless of how interesting your world building is, if you don't have good characters, your readers aren't going to have anything to hold on to, they're not going to have anything to sympathize with, and you're going to lose them. So the characters are really important. And when you're putting characters into a world that you've built, they will have a place and a relationship to the culture and the society within that world. And you need to be aware and intentional about the connections that you make between the culture in your world and the history that you've set up, the lore that you've set up, all the things that I talked about already in this video. You need to have your current culture in the world connected to all those things. One thing will lead to another. If you have a society that is maritime based, that lives on the coast, then the culture will probably be based around selling fish and having fishing vessels, having shipping, having things tied to maritime, having tied to the ocean. Anything like that, if you have something that's set in the desert, then maybe it's a nomadic kind of culture. You need to tie your culture into the world to make it feel real, and then you need to tie your characters into that culture. It's all about having the right kind of connections so that it's believable and one thing makes sense because it's tied into everything else. If you don't do that, if you don't pay attention to the connections, or if you have all of your characters just created for a purpose to fill a part in your plot and you just drop them into your world, you're going to end up with some situations where there are a lot of characters in unintentional fish out of water situations where the character fits the plot. They fit the need that you have for them to do something to move the plot forward, but they don't feel like they fit in the world that you've created. They don't feel like they have a place in the city. They don't have a proper place in society or in the structure or however you've set that up. So it's really important to pay attention to the connections between the history of the world, how that influences current culture, and where your character fits into that culture, where they fit economically, where they fit as far as slang they use, the language they use, the people that they know, where they go in society, where they travel, where they're welcome, where they're not. All of these things are connected. So pay close attention to those connections, make sure they make sense, and make sure the character has a feeling of place in the story, and that will go a long ways towards maintaining your consistency and continuity in your world building. So those are just a few techniques that I use in my world building and in my writing to make sure that things stay consistent and that the continuity is there with different aspects of the world building. It really all just comes back to planning and having connections between the different parts of the world building, the different parts of the story, and then having a way to keep track of it so that you can refer back to it and make sure that you don't contradict yourself when you're writing future things based on things you've written in the past. So that's how I do it. I'd be interested in hearing if you have other techniques for keeping things straight in your world building and keeping things consistent. So drop some ideas in the comments here and let me know how you do it or what you think. And make sure to like this video if it helps, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos.